Welcome to Dig History Podcast.
In 1938, a German couple, their last name Nauer, welcomed a new baby into their family. Their joy was quickly replaced by horror and grief when they realized that their newborn child was severely disabled, with malformed arms and legs. The child also suffered from convulsions. The child's father took the baby to the Leipzig University Children's Clinic, where he asked director Werner Cattell not only if he could admit his baby to the hospital, but also asked if Cattell would help his baby to die. Cattell refused. It was illegal to kill a baby, no matter how severe their level of disability. Mr. Nauer then went directly to German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, writing a plea to the Führer to ask that he allow his child to be euthanized. The Nauer family's plea ended up in the hands of Philipp Bühler, the head of Hitler's private chancellery. Bühler brought the plea directly to Hitler, who decided that he must respond.
Hitler asked his private physician, Karl Brandt, and instructed him to investigate the case, consult with the doctors in Leipzig, and if he found that the child truly was doomed to a life of pain and inability, Hitler gave Brandt authority to kill it. Brandt followed these orders to the letter, and within a few weeks, the Nauer baby was killed.
Inspired by the doomed Nauer infant and his father, who so tragically and so desperately wanted his child to die, Hitler decided that such decisions should not be made on an ad hoc basis, and thus took the Nazi race hygiene and eugenics project into its first murderous step: the organized, deliberate, and state-sponsored killing of children with disabilities. Within 4 years, this program would expand to include both children and adults that the National Socialist state declared life unworthy of life, resulting in the killing of around 200,000 or more men, women, and children. In today's episode in our eugenics series, we're talking about eugenics and its monstrous German result, the Nazi euthanasia program. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Avril.
And we are your historians for this very depressing episode of Dig.
We will come back to those decisions in 1938, but we can't understand how we got to the killing of the Nauer baby without understanding first the transnational eugenics project taking place around the world, as well as the unique eugenics project growing within the Nazi regime. Starting in the mid-19th century with the work of Charles Darwin, people around the world started to become increasingly interested in trying to use the principles of Darwinism to understand how humans, and by extension, societies, evolved. When Darwinian theories were combined with the work of other scientists, such as Gregor Mendel, who pioneered the science of genetic inheritance through his work with pea plants, people around the world began to think about how Darwinian concepts like evolution and survival of the fittest might connect to genetics. It was Darwin's relative, Francis Galton, who first coined the term eugenics, or the science of manipulating human breeding to curate a better populace. In the early 20th century, eugenics was a tremendously exciting science, with the potential to improve everything from public health to education to national treasury.
The idea was that any number of social ills might be cured through the careful control of human breeding. Just as Mendel was able to shift and change and manipulate his garden peas through selective breeding, so could nations control their populations by controlling reproduction. Doctors and scientists considered all sorts of things hereditary traits. Eye color and hair color and things like that, yes, of course, but also things like intelligence and behavior. And as a quick reminder, and this has come up in, I think, all of the episodes in the series, but I just want to make sure it's here in case you're listening to this one episode out of context, there are two different kinds of eugenics, positive and negative. This has nothing to do with whether or not they're good or bad, but instead refers to what kind of action they involve.
An important component to all of this was the veneer of scientific objectivity. For example, researchers used diagnostic tests like the intelligence quotient, or the IQ test, to determine where people fell on a hierarchy of capacity. While these kinds of tests gave the impression of being objective, they were actually deeply shaped by pre-existing social prejudice.
And still are.
And still.
IQ tests.
For example, during World War I, the United States Army allowed Harvard psychologist Robert Yerkes to perform IQ tests on nearly 2 million enlisting soldiers. Unsurprisingly, Yerkes found that certain groups consistently performed poorly, specifically immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, while native-born whites tended to do much better. Yerkes insisted that this reflected these groups' hereditary inferiority, not the fact that, English wasn't their first language and they didn't have the same access to American education, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. They asked, really specific questions about, the rules of baseball and stuff like that, you just wouldn't, most people just wouldn't know, or many people wouldn't know.
Right. Stupid. The result of the IQ testing was then touted as proof that immigrant populations were dangerous to the white American race. They had the potential to interbreed with whites and dilute their superior bloodlines. They were also weaker and more sickly and thus prone to spreading sickness to white Americans. Even more importantly, these inferior people reproduced rapidly and without consideration to the quality of their offspring, which tended to be impoverished and thus had a high likelihood of going on the public dole, draining the system for generations while contributing to nothing. To the eugenicists, this all seemed like evidence that these inferior people would hold the whole nation back in its progress.
It may seem odd to start with American examples, but we aren't choosing them arbitrarily. And I promise it is not because I am an Americanist. In this case, usually it is. In this case, it's not. American scientists and reformers were the leaders in the global eugenics project. For example, the Americans were the early adopters of the conclusion that the best way to stem the uncontrolled breeding of inferior groups was through sterilization, and I should say forced sterilization, right? Indiana passed the first sterilization law in 1907, and within 2 decades, half of all American states had some sort of sterilization law. Of course, probably the most well-known sterilization law was the one in Virginia that led to the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, in which the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the state's right to control the reproduction of citizens through sterilization, with or without their consent, as a measure for the public good. It's also the case that gave us Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s famous statement in support, infamous statement in support of eugenics: 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And if you haven't read Paul Lombardo's book about the history of Buck v. Bell, highly recommend it.
Much like in the U.S. before World War I, the German eugenics movement was embraced by pretty much everyone across the political spectrum. Unlike the U.S., however, before World War I, the German eugenics movement was less concerned with race and more concerned with class. The poor seemed like the potential problem because of the fear that they would be a drain on the public purse, not a particular group of people deemed ethnically problematic. This isn't to say that the Germans didn't think about race at all. They certainly believed that white people were superior to dark-skinned people. After all, they developed racial hierarchies that during their imperial projects in Africa. But race didn't seem like a pressing problem for Germans like it did for Americans, who had a far more racially diverse population.
Right. For Germans, the non-whites, largely before World War I, were the people who lived in the colonies.
Yes. There is a split between German scientists, however, over one aspect of race: the question of whether or not a Nordic, or as they soon began to call it, Aryan race was superior to others. Increasingly, the pro-Nordic scientists began to embrace the term Rassenhygiene, or race hygiene, to describe their particular approach to eugenics. During most of the first half of the 20th century, the 2 terms, eugenic and Rassenhygiene, were used interchangeably, that is, until the rise of the Third Reich.
One of the most important German eugenic scientists was Eugen Fischer. In 1908, Fischer conducted a study of the offspring of Dutch colonizers and Khoikhoi, who Europeans often refer to as Hottentots. His published study, which cemented his career and made him the leading German eugenicist, also significantly impacted the direction German eugenics took in the years following. In particular, Fischer's work informed the creation of the Nuremberg Laws, which Averill talked about in great detail in an episode a while back. Fischer also cemented the place of race in German eugenics and upheld the superiority of the Aryan race. He wrote this in his 1908 study. We still do not know a great deal about the mingling of the races, or Rassenmischung, but we certainly know this. Without exception, every European nation that has accepted the blood of inferior races, and only romantics can deny that Negroes, Hottentots, and many others are inferior, has paid for its acceptance of inferior elements with spiritual and cultural degeneration.
The racial element of eugenic thought crystallized during the upheaval of the Weimar Republic. As disaffected Germans turned toward nationalism to help them make sense of their World War I defeat, the concept of German racial superiority and a society based on racial purity was appealing. This nationalistic racist ideology became known as Völkisch. Later, the Nazis morphed the concept of Völkisch into the term Volk, which referred to the German people as a strong, racially homogeneous whole. The leading scientists who embraced a Völkisch version of eugenics included Eugen Fischer, who worked for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin-Dahlem, Ernst Rudin, a founding member of the Society for Race Hygiene, and later director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, Ottmar von Verschuer, a doctor known for his interests in twin studies who worked with Fischer in Berlin, and Hans Gunther, professor at University of Jena and University of Berlin. All of these men would go on to join the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, and be powerful scientific advisors to Adolf Hitler. They would also become the architects of the Nazi program to purge, quote-unquote, inferior peoples from the German public.
Over the Weimar period, the race hygiene wing of German science grew. Numerous centers were founded, like the ones that we just mentioned that all of those men worked at, to study race science. And by 1923, German universities offered dozens of classes on race hygiene. In 1921, 3 leading eugenicists, Fischer, Aaron Bauer, and Fritz Lenz, published one of 2 texts that became foundational to Nazi race science, entitled Outline of Human Genetics and Racial Hygiene. The concepts outlined in the book appeared later in another foundational Nazi text, Hitler's Mein Kampf. But I mentioned that there were 2 texts that became foundational specifically to Nazi science. The other was the 1920 book by Karl Binding and Alfred Hoch, entitled Authorization for the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life. Binding was a legal scholar and Hoch was a psychiatrist. And if I understand correctly, Binding did most of the writing and Hoch sort of justified it with a kind of a social science lens afterwards. Or after it was largely written, I should say. The text focused not on the issue of race in the German eugenics project, but on the issue of disability, specifically the population of Germans who lived in institutions with psychiatric or intellectual disabilities. The book explicitly argued that the law should allow for the death of so-called incurable feeble-minded. And I should pause here to say that the term feeble-minded was very, very broad. It could mean a great many things. Like you could be alcoholic and be considered feeble-minded. You could be quote-unquote sexually promiscuous and that would make you feeble-minded. It didn't necessarily always mean that you were had some sort of intellectual or developmental disability, right? Binding reasoned that suicide should be considered a human right and expanded that right to the right to die to avoid an otherwise long or painful death. And his example is cancer. If you have cancer, you should have the right to choose to die on your own terms. But then Binding and Hoch expanded this even further, arguing that there was a category of people called Lebensunwert, or life unworthy of life. This included people dying slowly of painful diseases like cancer, but also people who were so inferior, so disabled, that they also deserved to die. To quote historian Henry Friedlander, quote, "He used the argument that the terminally ill deserve the right to die a relatively painless death to justify the murder of those considered inferior." And I wrote painful death, but it's supposed to be painless.
Makes more sense.
Yes.
After this point, the idea of euthanasia became sort of fuzzy and unclear. When we talk about euthanasia today, we're often talking about our pets, putting them to sleep painlessly so they don't have to suffer anymore. We might also talk about physician-assisted suicide. But what Binding and Hulk proposed in this text was not that. Instead, they put forth the idea that euthanasia should be used to relieve not the individual patient, but the people. By killing people deemed lebenswert, they could help to ensure a stronger, pure Volk. While Binding looked at this from a legal standpoint, Hulk added his expertise as a physician. Hulk, unsurprisingly, rejected the tradition of first do no harm as required by the Hippocratic Oath. Instead, Hulk argued doctors always needed to balance individual needs against the greater good. Moreover, Hulk argued that this would be a good thing for the medical profession because by killing these useless eaters,
and that's the other term that they refer to them often as life unworthy of life or as useless eaters.
They would have the opportunity to gather useful anatomical specimens for research, which would help future doctors understand what caused disability and work to prevent it.
Right.
Spectrum 10K. Should we autistics have a right to live? I want to share with you guys my perspective. So basically what this is out in the UK, they're trying to recruit 10,000 individuals. I think it was supposed to be launched end of August. 10,000 autistic individuals across the UK for autism research. And what they're doing is having them fill out a questionnaire and taking their DNA, supposedly for the purpose of understanding autism better. Okay, sure. Here's the problem, though. They're in collaboration with people that are into eugenics. And here's where my concern begins. For a while now, there have been groups aiming towards being able to take an individual that they feel should not have the right to live, take the power into their own hands, to remove their existence from mankind because they decided they didn't think that they were adding value into society, and off they go. I think this is going to go, this Spectrum 10K, where I think that it's going to go. If it goes, this is where it's going to go. I see two real reasons why they're doing this, two real reasons. And there's going to be a lot more because there's a lot of money to be made in these kind of things. But here's where I think it's really going. Number one, if they can isolate certain genes in individuals and say, hey, this is the gene that causes depression, this is the gene that causes the anxiety symptoms, this is the gene that causes this. They can start modifying genes to deliberately create symptoms in people so they can market their drugs. Number one is I think this is about this and nothing else, nothing to do with helping. So if they can isolate the genes that we have in common that create certain symptoms, and they can alter our genes to create the ailments that they want to create so they can make us dependent on their drugs in a lot of different ways. The next one I'm most concerned about is, I don't know if you guys know what an amniocentesis is, but basically what it is it's a test that is used on a pregnant woman. They go into the amniotic fluid and take some fluid out to see if that baby is going to have like Down syndrome. And they like to say it's so that way they can just prepare the family for, what's to come. No. It's to give the parents an opportunity to abort that baby. That's really what it's for. Give them time to be able to choose to end that pregnancy. So they'll do the test and then they'll notify the parents, hey, it looks like there's a really good chance that your baby's going to have Down syndrome. What do you want to do about that? Well, pretty soon it's going to be, it looks like your baby's going to have autism. What do you want to do about that? Well, if you look at the way that autism is portrayed online, if you've been following like Fathering Autism, for example, it doesn't look like it's going to be the best life for you, does it? So if you're given that option in the early stages of your pregnancy to just hit the reboot and try again, the way that autism's been painted now, there's a lot of parents that would be terrified to find out they're having an autistic child